Welcome back to This Week in Soccer, and this week we have an exciting show. My name's Kartik Krishnaiyer. I'm joined by Lawrence McKenna. Hi, Lawrence.
Hi, Kartik. It's good to be here.
And Richard Farley. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Kartik. It's good to be here.
We are in the middle of yet another international break, which I know just thrills so many of our viewers and listeners around the globe. So, in the midst of this international break, let's kick off talking about the international break. Players, important players for clubs, consistently getting injured guys on international duty, pulling up lame in training for internationals, taking long flights just to train and get injured. Where do you guys come down on this? Because I know club football and a lot of the bigger clubs in Europe are having concerns about this and are banding together in some ways to demand compensation from national teams. Now, of course, they get a per diem compensation now, which they didn't get before. That's relatively new. But should there be some sort of greater compensation if you lose a player on international duty?
What about the question? Well, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I guess it was the club sides that came first. And even if they did come first, then does that even matter? But what I mean to say here is, well, surely the international sides, can they demand compensation when their international players get injured then?
What would be the compensation?
Well, why do clubs get compensation? Is if the players are somehow owned by them? Because the players also make a choice to opt into being a national player as well. So
they are kind of owned by them. They have contracts.
Yeah, no, they're owned by them, but at the same time, if you opt into international football, then in a sense you're opting into being owned by your national team as well, aren't you?
Well, you're kind of opted in. Most people are either opted in by birth or they make a one-time choice, so it's not quite the same.
But yeah, but you can choose whether you want to play international football or not, and you can. Do you see what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I completely agree that players can choose whether they want to play international football, whether they are going to subject themselves to the risks, and at the same time, clubs have to be aware of player preferences when they elect to sign them. I wouldn't begrudge clubs if they took a more active role in trying to negotiate out players' ability to go and play for their national teams. Obviously, that would affect which players want to come and play for their clubs. But with these players being such prized commodities, you really have to factor in how much of their time is going to be spent away from your club when you're deciding how to compensate them and for how long to compensate them. And from that point of view, I'm not really sure that national teams or clubs really should be accountable to each other. Rather, the responsibility, Kartik, really should be thrown back onto the players.
Yeah.
If that's the case, then the players are under contract monetarily to the club teams, correct? And they're not contracted. They are not in a position where they're millions of pounds, millions of euros tied up at the international level. But I guess maybe they are in sponsorships and such.
Yeah,
so wouldn't that naturally just fall towards the clubs?
But what you're saying there, Kartik, though, is again, we're putting the main weight on the money which is running those things. I understand that is what allows those things, but again, there are other reasons why people play football. There are other reasons why they do these things, and often we just can't discount them.
Isn't the investment monetarily and the potential drawback monetarily, financially, more on the clubs? Isn't that onus on the clubs? Don't they lose more by losing a player than a national team?
I don't know. I mean, a national team still has to sell shirts. They still have to attract people to games. They still have the same. I guess they have similar contracts with their sponsors, etc. So I don't see why the pressures should be any different, apart from the fact that these national teams seem to exist, whether they've got a sponsor or not, if you see what I mean.
Because financially, one of these two parties has much more risk in this. And I can see you're trying to basically say, well, some football isn't better than others. There's certain, let's not put one of these different games on top of the other. Let's try to respect the fact that one of these worlds is different than the other, but it's on the same level. But as Kartik is implying, and as the premise to kind of like this discussion is implying, one of these two worlds is loaded with financial commitment and risk associated with that financial commitment. So if somebody gets injured and is out for 2 years, the losses for a Manchester United extend beyond what the financial losses would be for an England. Perhaps for England, if we're talking about somebody like Wayne Rooney, the actual competitive loss is greater. But when you're talking about shirt sales and ticket sales and all of the rest of this, the loss for Manchester United is probably going to be much greater than it is for England.
Now, Lawrence, think about the Michael Owen example. He gets hurt on international duty for England. They are forced to compensate Newcastle United. They go on and buy Obafemi Martin. It's a pretty good signing, actually, for Newcastle for a few seasons. So there is a precedent that if a player is consistently getting hurt on international duty, I think of Robin van Persie. He's gotten hurt. He got hurt for the Dutch, serious injuries for the Dutch more often than he got hurt for Arsenal. Now, he had these nagging minor injuries with Arsenal that continued to keep him out, but with his major injuries were both on Netherlands national team duty. Yet Arsenal didn't get any compensation from the Dutch national team, from the Dutch Federation.
Well, yeah, I guess then again there is an issue there, isn't there? That if you demand compensation from one person but you're not from the other, do you think it? I guess there's because it's more difficult to chase. Maybe it's easier to chase England. I also think you're into just very sticky territory with all of this.
Should England turn around and say to Liverpool, Daniel Sturridge got injured, we could have used him in the Ukraine, we might have won the match?
Well, that's what I'm saying should those guys ask for compensation? You're just getting into very sticky territory because what you're asking for is money based on something.
Sturridge is contracted to Liverpool. He's not contracted to England.
So I think Richard makes a great point here that the responsibility in the end, it lies with the player, right? And the player, if the player chooses to go to England duty, then that's his or her responsibility. But I also think, Kartik, we're making points here about what, as if this is a black and white situation, as if then someone owes them compensation. I think you're getting into sticky territory when people are saying, he had a recurring injury. Does that mean that because it's recurring, or he originally picked it up at the club, then the club caused this issue, etc.? I just don't see how this is a sustainable model for both of these to take. And also, I see how it's inconvenient, but I don't like the politics which goes on between the two. Because
I think I would like to build on that, because I think what Lawrence. The main thing of what he's saying is that there's never going to be an easy answer to this. There are going to be situations where somebody blows out their knee, international level, had no pre-existing conditions, and you can definitely say that happened in one of these two parties' hands. But if you're trying to find an overarching rule to apply to it, there are going to be situations where chronic injuries are going to be a little bit harder to lay in one party's hands or another. I think an easier solution is for both parties just to accept that this is the nature of the game, but circling back to what I said initially, what that's going to lead to, and I would be fully supportive of clubs doing this, is saying, look, if you are going to go and play for your national team, we're not going to bar you from doing that, but no, if you get injured on international duty, we have the right to cancel your contract.
But that's exactly the same as when God made that guy blind, and then he says, but you've got a choice. And it's like, well, no, because I've lost my eyes. You've taken my eyes away, you've taken my legs, and then you want the rest. It is. No,
it isn't. It's more like saying if you go out and become blind, you're not making somebody blind and then giving them a choice.
Yeah, but what you're saying is then we will not stand by you. And I think your initial point probably holds more water.
What I'm saying is that international duty and any other physical activity becomes the same as the list of other things in your contract that you are precluded from doing. Only it doesn't go quite to that level. Then it doesn't go quite to that level. What it basically says, we're allowing you to do this, just as we're allowing you to play with your kids in the backyard or do anything else that is reasonable behavior. But know that if you have an injury that is sustained away from club duty, we have the right to cancel your contract. Right. Just like you have the right to walk away from the deal if we don't live up to our end of the deal. Now I see the look on your face. You're saying, "Oh, this is ludicrous. Somebody shouldn't be precluded from playing for their country." It's a totally separate thing. It is a totally separate thing, Lawrence. You have a deal with your club. It doesn't say anything or doesn't bind you to behaviors with your country. It's just a norm of the soccer world right now. And at some point, clubs will have so much invested in their players, they already do, that it becomes sensible to try to negotiate language to protect your investment.
And I agree wholeheartedly, Richard. I think probably your initial point holds more water about the club standing by people. But I also think then, so where's the initiative for international and FAs to invest at youth level? Because if they want to help develop that youth, and then they see it through to the national team, then obviously there's a huge incentive there. But if the clubs are providing monetary incentives and anti-incentives to not go towards those things, then I'd imagine that would make an even more difficult relationship with the FA. And I just don't see. I almost see it as cutting off their nose to spite their face in a way, because what they're saying there is, oh, you can't do this because of that. And
this is applicable in other countries other than England, because in England, quite frankly, the FA, for all their big talk, have relied on the clubs exclusively to develop talent.
But in other places that and obviously most people
France,
say that
it's
the
different,
critical,
for example, France and Holland.
Exactly. A lot of people say the critical years is where you develop with the club. You know, they take you on from 15, whatever age they want to take you on, and they'll develop you at a critical age. But at the same time, I think the point still stands that, you know, the youth development is still a very important part of their life and their career. And, you know, that we would be taking away a huge incentive to do that if that's the case.
If that's really the case, then the FA and the other organizations that are interested in developing talent for the national team's cause will come up with some counter incentives. They'll either compensate players more, they'll enter into contracts with the clubs, they will give players and clubs incentives to buy into the national team system. And that is kind of the root of this whole conversation. There is so much incentive and risk on one side of this equation that really the national teams, if it does have as much prestige and as much following, and it has so much incentive in preserving ticket sales and shirt sales as we're implying, then they should be able to offer some kind of countermeasure to this.
I think that then hamstrings a lot of in international sides, such as
it does.
very small CONCACAF sides. I mean, we were in Bermuda this summer, and you know those guys are operating on a shoestring budget compared to the United States.
Right, but they don't have the guys that necessarily. They had Sean Goder, obviously, with Man City for years, but Bermuda is a bad example. They don't have the guys with the big clubs. Maybe a better example would be
some of their
Mexico.
players. Yeah, sure. What I'm making the point that even if whether they have a big guy or not, Kartik, they're still an important player to someone. But also at the same time, they might have a big player in the future, and he might become important to someone. I mean, I know, Richard, you've probably got a really good point. One thing I really want to bring up, though, is the fact that we're probably overlooking the importance of nationality when it comes down to the identity of a player, building a brand around the player, etc., etc. Mesut Ozil will be perceived in a completely different way if he wasn't a German player. And I think very often we're overlooking the intangibles just because the tangibles hold such weight in the game.
Fair point, Richard.
I mean, we should really be talking about what is really underlying this conversation. It's something that we talked about when Bobby McMahon was on the show last week. For a lot of people, there's just this inherent assumption that international football just is. And that's just not true. International football is falling far behind the club game. And that's not to say that it should or it shouldn't, but it's a reality of the world that all of the financial risk, all of the financial incentive in the game is on one side of this equation. And so to step up to a discussion and kind of just imply international football just is, and we have to deal with it, and people should be allowed to do it, that's fine. It doesn't reflect the reality of it. It doesn't really further this conversation. What we have to do is try to conceive of a world where international football either catches up or provides some countermeasure to the reality that is the modern game. And so when you're talking about a situation like a lower level team in CONCACAF, well, they don't face the same incentives because none of their players are carrying huge financial risks with their injuries. But if you're talking about an organization
Sean Goater, like Kartik made a good point about Sean Goater.
But he was one exception. They have Kyle White.
So what we're saying is
but in Mexico, let's take Mexico for example. They got Chicharito at Manchester United. They've got Giuseppe at Valencia. They've got players carrying that financial risk. Carlos Vela has made the decision that he's not going to play for Mexico anymore. He's going to focus on his career in Spain.
Cool.
And so there's all this other, and there was a great feature last night on our coverage here in the States of that game of Giuseppe saying, in Mexico they don't trust me to be a professional. Here at Valencia they do. So players have that in their mindset too, guys from different countries, that they're not treated with the same level of respect as they are by their employers. Valencia is his employer.
I think for a long time we have just been letting national teams, national FAs, federations, just get by on the fact that you're the national team, people want to play for you, that just is how it is. Like Kartik is implying, a lot of the FAs just don't meet professional standards that most people have at their club levels, and a lot of that is because they can't, because they're not well funded. But let's stop bending over backwards and just allowing this to be the state of the world. Let's at some point go to these national federations, or let's at least from a fan level, from a follower level, really look at it and say, you know what, you're not worthy of being on the same level as some of these clubs that people play for. You're not worthy of making the same demands. You don't provide the same infrastructure. You don't provide the same support. You don't provide the same financial incentives even. Your stipends that you give these players are so much less than their salaries. So why should we consider you on equal footing? You have a stake in the game, just not an equal one.
So yeah, but also again, I understand about this stake in the game, but we're wholly basing this conversation on money here. I mean,
but that's what's driving the modern game, Lawrence.
Well,
it's not romanticism, it's not idealism, but maybe we would envision something different.
I get what Lawrence is saying, though, but the thing is, once you stop talking about money, you really are talking about individual motivations, and we can't sit here and go through every single person's individual motivations.
Right. So why don't we just allow for the fact?
Why don't we just allow for the fact? Why don't we just allow for the fact that individual circumstances based on personal preferences may vary? Because it's really not worth talking about, because we would have to go into every single individual circumstance ever. So let's just trust the listeners to know that individual circumstances like a Brad Friedel may vary. Now let's talk about the things that apply to most people, that everybody can get to, and that really is the financial and professional incentives. So we can keep talking about.
So what you're saying is you're saying again here, which is overlooks, is that just because a minority is suffering, we should therefore overlook those problems.
No, they're not even suffering. Why are you assuming they're suffering? Some people, like Carlos Vela, is doing this in the best interest of his career. Is he suffering? Maybe he wants to play a little bit, but
maybe
he's
Mexico's suffering, but he's not.
We can't speak for him.
Why are you focusing on the tearjerkers?
Because those are I'm a romanticist, right? No, because
why don't you focus on Samuel Eto'o, who keeps walking away from Cameroon of his own volition? Don't you think he should have the choice to do that? And don't you think Cameroon is more wrong in that scenario than Samuel Eto'o is? Why don't we talk about Cameroon here? I'm crying for them.
Okay, so I'll cry for them too. I don't know enough about the situation to talk about them, but I know that I'm crying for them in some way, Richard. But I think, I mean, to some extent my point's been lost in this, but what I'm saying is that there are huge benefits to international football, and I think a lot of people are overlooking the amount of money that people are making from international football. Adidas are making a huge amount of money from international football. Nike are making a huge amount of money from international football. Those guys are pumping money into the game and are able to fund other things on a national level because of that. Spain winning 3 things in a row certainly makes a huge difference financially to Adidas and to other people, because they sell a lot more product. So we're overlooking the financial incentives for independent companies as well. And I think if we continue to overlook those things, and we continue to overlook the way that the finances are structured, and because the finances are poorly structured between the international and the arguably the rich clubs who are able to deal in this way, because they can be bullish, because they are rich, and they can afford to boss people around and tell them how they want it to be, that's the reason we're in this situation, is because at some point people haven't come to the table. Both sides haven't come to the table. In the same way that the clubs haven't come to the table with the fans, they haven't come to the table with the international sides, because they don't care about those people. Because, like you're saying, the bottom line to them is the money. And I think that there's a real issue with that, Richard, because if we're going to moralize about whether someone... exactly.
You think Sir Alex Ferguson, when he encouraged Scholes to retire from the national team, when he encouraged Gary Neville to retire from the national team, he was concerned about the money aspect of it? No, he was concerned about the competition.
Well, he was concerned about the competition as well, but again, if we're not going to pick out individual situations in one part, then I'd imagine we shouldn't do the same here.
But this is always a great way to derail any discussion in the soccer realm. It's just like, oh, whatever you're saying, it always comes down to money, and people always pay too much attention to money.
No, I'm not derailing anything. I'm not derailing anything, Richard. What I'm saying is that I think that I'm not making the point that money invalidates whatever the point is. What I'm saying is that money makes a lot of people bullish, and it also makes a lot of people bully others into situations, and I don't think
so. It's not about the money; it's just about money bullying things. I'll just step back from you specifically. I'll just say in general, this happens a lot, because the beginning of this conversation was really about the responsibilities that clubs and international teams share as it concerns players, specifically when players get injured. And of course, there's a financial element to it. And anytime there's even a slight financial element to something, whether you're talking about the evolution of the modern game, the duopolies that we talked about before, sometimes a lot of people will just kind of go, oh, modern money's influence on the game, it's terrible, it's horrible, and then the conversation gets sidelined into this moralistic debate rather than talking about the realities of the actual world.
Saying it's terrible.
I'm not saying that you're saying anything. I'm just saying that, in general, this happens a lot. And what it really does is create a dialogue where we're not talking about the modern state of the game. We're talking about a fantasy land that existed 30 years ago, or our want to go back to it. That's just not the case. At some point, we have to realize
there's so much romanticism about this in England in particular, Lawrence. Not to single you out personally, but there's so much romanticism. I read Henry Witter's columns, and it's all about back in the day when the clubs were reined in, and David Kahn writes the same thing. It's a fantasy land, and quite frankly, the English club game was a weakling at that point, right? They were getting pushed around by the English FA. Now the clubs have exercised their real economic strength.
But again, their club, there was a different economic structure in the game, and they didn't have the Premier League and those kind of things. And I think also that's a very different time in football, as we spoke about before.
But hasn't this grown the sport? The recognition of the sport, hasn't it grown the scope of football globally?
But
the clubs have empowered themselves in this way.
So I agree, Kartik. But what we're taking on is the end goals of a lot of bigger companies and a lot of big people who are saying we want this to be a global game, which I have no problem with. What I'm saying is don't get lost in the arguments that are made just because they want to expand their supporter base because it'll sell them more shirts or because it'll blah blah blah. We know the reasons why people want to expand those things. I'm not saying that money is necessarily corrupting anyone, but what I'm saying is it does allow people certain luxuries. And the issue is that if you allow the people with money the luxuries, then when those people don't have the money anymore, or they're moving it around between different people, then you're moving morally between a lot of different areas. And the bottom line is that it means that at one point someone will be in power as a truck of money, and then the next minute someone else will be in, and it just doesn't give you any sort of consistency within the game, and I think that's a huge issue. Is that there is no consistency to the arguments that are being made. In the same way that Newcastle, there's no consistency. They can get Owen's money, but someone else can't, because they choose to go to the right areas and they choose to strike at a certain time when they either know someone's financially weak or etc. etc.
Fair point, Lawrence. That might be the case, but again, I think you're missing the fact that the scope of the game, the stakes of the clubs have grown immeasurably in the last 15 years. There are stakes around individual players.
I agree with that, Kartik, but what I'm saying here is that you can almost say the same about the way that the internet has grown over the last few years. So it's become a lot thicker, and there's a lot more, there are a lot of people getting online. Just because those people are online doesn't mean that they have a stake in the internet and they feel engaged by it. It's a thicker kind of democracy, but it doesn't include everyone. And you can't. I understand you can't make rules for everyone because that would be ridiculous. But what I'm saying is that it leaves certain people out. It leaves certain people out, and it excludes people.
I have to say that this is not a relationship which is mutually exclusive or it's mutually beneficial. In fact, I would argue the World Cup is now a much larger international event than the Olympics because of the interest in club football and club footballers, the interest in Wayne Rooney, the interest in Robin van Persie, the interest in Lionel Messi around the globe, in Asia, in Africa. The interest in specific clubs, Liverpool, Arsenal, Real Madrid, Barcelona, whoever, has driven interest in countries where the World Cup was not a big deal previously, whose countries never qualified for the World Cup to watch that event.
But again, just because it's bigger, just because you're a majority doesn't make you
right.
I'm
saying international football has benefited directly from the growth of the club game.
And the club game has benefited directly from having different nationalities being able to move between all these places. Does Lionel Messi being Argentinian give him something else to his product? It probably does.
The Bosman ruling. Well, I can see that point to you, Lawrence. I agree with you on that because I think certainly if Mesut Ozil had chosen to play for Turkey, as Nuri Sahin did, really good player, went to Real Madrid also, is now back at Borussia Dortmund. We view Ozil's a better player than Sahin, but maybe we view Sahin a little differently if he were a German international than we did as a Turkish international. That's certainly a fair point.
I'm not saying that the money is a terrible thing in the game, although I am, but also that I just think to overlook these aspects and to say that we're just going to base this.
Fans of national teams also have to understand when players opt not to play for their national team. Giuseppe Rossi, I go back and forth. I know Richard's been in the midst of this debate too with some people. I've pointed out to so many U.S. national team fans who are like, that guy's a traitor. He's Benedict Arnold. As a commercial property, Giuseppe Rossi had a short shelf life, and now he's had injury problems. He's now back in Italy at Fiorentina, but he got hurt when he was at Villarreal. Didn't it benefit him personally to be an Italian international on the transfer market rather than an American international? I don't think that's even a debatable question. He benefited from being Italian.
It probably does benefit him in Europe because people, it's much easier to get to Italy.
Benefits him anywhere.
The States. Well, you could say the same about someone like Junior Hoylett, right? Junior Hoylett at one time was questionable over whether he was going to play for Canada or whether he was going to play
Begovic
for
also,
Jamaica. Yeah, and I think the reason Begovic chose to stay in Europe was because it's easier for him to get to those places, although I would imagine that actually it's probably a shorter amount of time to fly to the States than it is to fly very far east in Europe. But the point still stands, that there is this financial incentive of which international side you play for. Hoylett didn't choose, incidentally, until after his transfer because he, I think it would probably get the club more money, to be honest. Should we move on? Unless Richard does actually have a concluding point.
I just still kind of wonder whether we decided if national teams should compensate clubs for injuries or not.
Do you want to one word answer? I'm going to say no. Richard?
Yeah, I'm gonna say we can leave it on a case by case basis, and clubs can start negotiating that into contracts. And I realize that some clubs are monster clubs, and we shouldn't be siding with money ever. But we can kind of just let players and clubs work it out on an individual basis, I feel.
Kartik?
I'm with Richard. I think that's the way I would handle it. Clubs can figure it out on an individual basis. Players can figure it out on an individual basis. It can be stipulated in contracts. And the precedent is set by the Michael Owen case that there's a possibility if you write it into your contract that the club will get compensated if someone gets injured on international duty, and we've seen a lot of that. Manchester City doesn't even have Di Michelis for a cup of coffee, and he gets injured on Argentina duty. So there's a clear example of that.
I do love a good debate. I really enjoyed that. But next up, we're going to have to move on to topic 2, which is actually quite an interesting one, and it's, should the Premier League require more homegrown players on squads? Kartik, I know that you've got a mixed perception of this one.
Yeah, I look at, obviously, we just went through the 25-man player squads again. This exercise we go through every few months after transfer windows, and I noticed that it seems like there are fewer and fewer homegrown players with top clubs in England, with your Arsenals, your Chelseas. I should say registered homegrown players, because Arsenal and Chelsea both have a slew of under 21 kids who are English or who came through their academy. Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United, even Everton, fewer homegrown players than in previous years. But I think about this. I favor the free market as far as getting players in. I think there should be some limit, maybe on players that were raised outside of the country. But homegrown players, remember, in England includes players who are English or Welsh, or guys that spent at least 18 months in the country prior to the age of, help me out here, is it prior to the age of 18?
I think it's 18, isn't it? It is 18, yeah, because people buy them at they bring them over at 16, don't they?
Yeah. So, for example, Manchester City has registered Diedrich Boyata as a homegrown player, and he is he's Belgian, but he's been in Manchester City's academy since he was 15. So that's an example of how you can take an intake of foreign players under the age of 18, EU players, and you can register them. I'm really mixed on this because I think there needs to be some effort to preserve the Englishness or the indigenous aspects of English football in the top flight. At the same time, I don't want to be getting into the kind of player restrictions Spain and Italy have on foreign players, because I think that has ultimately hurt those products, hurt those leagues. Maybe it's helped their national teams. This goes back to maybe the first debate. Maybe it's helped the Spanish national team that you can only have a handful of foreign players on Spanish teams that don't have EU passports. Same thing in Italy. But I think it ultimately has hurt the competitiveness and the product we've come to know as the Premier League. So I'm very much on the fence about this, and maybe 8 is the right number. Maybe it should be 6. Maybe it should be 12. I don't know. What do you think, Richard?
Richard, where do you stand on this one?
I don't really have a strong opinion on it. I think it's about the vision that the Premier League wants for itself, and to a certain extent, of course, people who follow the Premier League are going to have some say in that based on how much money they want to throw via tickets or indirectly via the viewership on the weekends. It really is about identity, I think. If the Premier League is willing to sacrifice its competitiveness, its drawing power, its prestige, in order to bring in more English players, I think they should go in that direction, and that probably bears some explanation. The idea that the Premier League can stay at its current stature while also prioritizing the incorporation of English talent is a bit inconsistent. Throughout my lifetime, there's been a huge debate as to why more English talent isn't being developed. And there have been a lot of reasons for that, based on purely the technical vision for the players, which has not kept up with the technical vision of the continent, the lack of actual money being invested, the lack of actual coaching, accredited coaches in England. You hear all these numbers about the per capita coaches registered in Spain and Germany compared to England, and England is very, very low in that category. And we see it in the product that the English national team is not only fielding now, but is also bringing through. There's not going to be a point in the near future where England is going to be competitive with the top teams in Europe. Spain, Germany leading the way, but also France, Belgium now, Holland, Italy. All these teams are ahead of England. So if you're going to then base a league on bringing that talent, which is inferior to the talent on the continent, into a league and presumably have it being a contributing part to the league, well, it's logical to assume that your league is going to follow the path of your national team. Maybe not so much, because you're still going to have the ability to draw huge name talent, but if all of the countries in Europe are trying to incorporate homegrown talent, and England's homegrown talent is inferior, then the Premier League needs to decide if they want to base their competitive model on an inferior talent stream. And Lawrence, I don't have a problem with that. It's just a matter of what people want for the Premier League.
I actually had this conversation over lunch with someone today about whether it is a short-term suffering for a long-term gain, and what the loss is, and also whether a league becomes less entertaining, or a national team becomes less entertaining because they choose to play a younger player. Maybe it'll make it more compelling in a way. Maybe we're overlooking the reason people watch.
It's made Wales more entertaining to be playing Ramsey, Bale, Jonathan Williams, and I'm blanking out a couple other really good young Welsh players.
Robbie Savage.
Well, no, but he's not one of them. That was when we didn't watch Wales. Was when even though we loved Gary Speed and we loved Ryan Giggs. Don't take anything away from Gary Speed and Ryan Giggs, but Bellamy and Savage were a bit too much for most of us, right?
Bellamy. Yeah, I agree. But I mean, that is an interesting question. Is will the Premier League actually lose out, or is it just overlooking what people actually watch the Premier League for, which might be some youth talent? And I think a lot of people actually enjoy watching their youth come through. There's nothing more satisfying than watching a young guy.
Yeah, and Richard, this is a conversation you and I have had, and maybe it's not appropriate for this particular discussion, but in the U.S. there seems to have been a real and maybe we've gotten away from it recently, but an embracing of the U20 level and the U17 tournaments, and the emphasis the United States program has put on those levels. And in past years, the U.S. Soccer media, and myself included, have treated the U20 World Cup or the U17 World Cup like it's this major international tournament, because we're thinking, okay, this will be our team in 3 to 5 years. Well, it never really works out that way, does it? But it's just been something that there's something exciting about that, about watching youth.
Yeah, and you and I, like you said, have talked about it. And I think a lot of that just plays into nationalism. A lot of that is the idea that if we do well here, we're going to do well at the next step. When really you're really only looking at the top 3 or 4 players there, and maybe a couple of other guys string through eventually. But
we've even had the conversation to say that none of them will come through at some point.
Yeah, maybe. But I kind of like the phrase that Lawrence used, and I think it could be a good focal point for this discussion: short-term suffering versus long-term gain. And I think that makes sense. If you were to inject all of the youth in right now, there would be a short-term setback, and the question is whether you would eventually get up to that same level, although by implication you would say that you would definitely improve on the level that you would create immediately. But I also think it's important to identify who's doing the suffering and who's doing the gaining. So in the short term, the competitive product suffers, and people presumably watching it, a lot of the people who come to the Premier League now because of the level of its product, thereby would probably suffer too. But the long-term gain, what is the long-term gain? Are you really talking about a league that is going to be better competitively in the future? I think that's a little bit of a stretch. It could possibly go back to the same level or close enough to the same level to not make it a discussion. Really, the long-term gain is for people who like England. And is that really enough considering the broad viewership and fandom that the Premier League has? Because when you're talking about people who like England or invested in English product as far as players are concerned, what sliver of the Premier League pie is that exactly right now? And when you consider that, aren't we really talking about this issue a little bit too much?
Well, Richard also makes a good point there. I think it's a twofold point at some point, though, that if we want to, if A, we think that therefore Englishness is what makes the Premier League so good, which I would argue, if you take many examples, most people say the English players are the worst players in the league.
No, but there's an English cultural aspect to the Premier League.
That
makes it so popular.
Well, yeah, but I mean, who's the face of the Premier League in the early 2000s? Is it an English player? You might say David Beckham was the face of the.
No, I'd
English
say
Premier League
Ryan Giggs was. He's Welsh.
Giggs?
I mean,
Thierry Henry, those kind of guys.
Okay,
It was because
Patrick Vieira,
exactly.
French.
2 French guys. That's so sickening to English people.
French
We hate
guys.
the French.
French guys who speak better English than any Englishman.
More beautiful English than any
English. More beautiful English.
Although,
but can I
make
make
my
a good point though? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, my second point is it really leads on from that. Therefore, that if we're thinking that the Premier League is somehow stronger because of these English people, one thing I would say is, should the Premier League and English football not be encouraging their own England nationals to go and engage with other leagues? Go outside of the Premier League. Look around Europe a little bit, and start to look a little bit further. If you want to be able to get into the England national team, maybe that should be a prerequisite at some point. Is that we need a certain number of people from other leagues, because it could benefit you in some way. As much as that hasn't been the case with Italy and Spain, who are 2 of the most successful, and probably Germany. But I think that at some point English football needs to diversify, and part of that might be England traveling.
Playing outside of Spain now. Spain actually has a large portion of their national.
Yeah, but I mean Barcelona is essentially.
Yeah,
but if we're talking about incorporating homegrown talent, how does that solve the problem? That actually worsens the issue. I mean, I agree that that's beneficial for players, but this conversation is about incorporating homegrown talent. How does that help anything? That actually hurts.
What I'm saying, Richard, is that the basis that people are working from is that if you include this homegrown talent, then somehow that benefits the league in some way. What I'm saying is that might be overlooking other factors which are not benefiting the homegrown talent. And if we're trying to build homegrown talent all the time, we're trying to progress these things, but we're overlooking the other factors which might be just as important as bringing homegrown talent through. What I'm saying.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm deliberately derailing the conversation. Richard.
No. I think you just looked at it from the other point of view. I mean, I want to go back to what Kartik talked about the inherent benefit of English culture in the game, and I think there is something to that. I think there's something to that in every league, that the league represents the domestic quality of the country it's in. But I don't really think, and this sounds weird, I don't really think players have anything to do with that. I think the stadium do. I think the crowds do. I think the presentation. I think, and Arsenal has proved this a couple of times, you don't have to have any English players on there to have an English culture come through in that atmosphere. I mean, granted, Emirates is a weird example of that, but still, for people around the world, they're still going to know this as a very English experience, even if you don't have more than a couple of English players on there. I just think that preserving culture is definitely something people should be interested in, but players, I think, carry almost an insignificant amount of that culture.
or
Yeah, I
not
agree
that the
with
players carry an insignificant amount of that, but that it's not as significant as we think that they integrate. I mean, there are numerous examples to do with that, right?
Right.
Xabi Alonso at Liverpool. Just people who integrate with the fans very well. People who the fans take under their wing.
Arbeloa is actually a better example because Arbeloa has taken English culture, taken it back to Spain, and he's anglicized. He's an Anglophile now.
Yeah, that's why he still has terrible hair. And I think you make a good point that you can integrate these people quite well. And I think Richard makes the best point is that when you go to the games, I guess also it's about what makes those games English. How many English people are at those games? Are there a lot of international? Are there a lot of foreigners at those games as well? Does that make it less English? What are we saying at that point?
Well, and I think this is something that World Soccer Talk covers extensively, and to a certain extent, almost exclusively. It's also how it's presented on television because that's how most people are taking in the Premier League. So a lot of discussion on the site is about the quality of announcing, and there are debates, or there used to be debates in the threads on the site about the place that an English accent has in covering the game. Now, somebody like Kyle Martino is currently proving that you don't need to have an English accent to cover this game, but there certainly does seem to be a certain level of authenticity to somebody that has come through, was born in England, has absorbed this culture, and when you talk about somebody like Arlo White, has gone back and re-ensconced themselves in that culture. There certainly seems to be a certain level of credibility to that. So when you're talking about how many people are in the stands, I think that adds to it. I think what they're doing in the stands adds to it. But I also think that there needs to be a certain respect of the English culture that comes across in the presentation, whether that presentation has English accents or not.
Yeah, Rich makes a good point. Although, again, I'd argue that I might feel disenfranchised by looking at what a lot of people feel English culture is.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
That is a very good point. Well, Lawrence, on that point, maybe it's time for us to transition into our third segment of the show. One of the constant debates that we have at World Soccer Talk and its predecessor, EPL Talk, is whether the primacy of the Premier League in the world game has sustained. On this show, we spend a lot of time talking about other leagues, and one league we're going to talk about in particular today is the German Bundesliga. For years, the German Bundesliga has been renowned for its rise, mostly based on its financial model. But as we saw last year in Champions League, its competitive model also seems to be catching up to the rest of Europe. Kartik, I want to start with you because with teams like Bayern Munich and Borussia Dortmund, the Bundesliga is getting a lot of attention, but as you go down that table, there are a lot of other quality sides. And when you match it up side by side with the Premier League, or when you step back and you consider the product in general, how do you think it stacks up against the renowned English language world's best league in the world?
I think it stacks up real well, Richard. Simply put, I having watched football for years, but let's just take this season for example. First 3 weeks of the Premier League, first 4 weeks of the Bundesliga. The quality of play in the Bundesliga is significantly higher. Not as many bad giveaways, not as many reckless challenges, not as many sloppy goals scored because of defensive breakdowns, and quite frankly, a product that is probably similar in entertainment value. The Premier League, I think, is probably still the most entertaining league in the world. Sometimes we confuse entertainment for quality. This has been an argument I've had with a number of people who are proponents of this primacy of the Premier League. And I am a fan of the Premier League. The Premier League is my favorite league. Let me just get that out of the way. The Bundesliga is not my favorite league. MLS is not my favorite league. Serie A is not. The Premier League is. My second favorite league is probably the Championship. Quite frankly, the two top divisions in England are my two favorite leagues. But I think there's been a confusion between entertainment value and quality. The quality of the Bundesliga, the quality of touches on the ball, the quality of passing, the quality of movement off the ball, the quality of goals scored, and the quality of defensive organization, to me right now, at least this season, from what I've watched, and I've watched a lot of both leagues, much better in the Bundesliga. I will put a caveat in this, though, before you respond, Lawrence, which is that England had a monster transfer window, outflow of players from the continent into England, which took place in this past couple of weeks. It is very possible once those players integrate at sides like Spurs, like Chelsea, like Manchester City, that the Premier League will regain its primacy. But from what I've seen early in the season, the Bundesliga is much better.
I mean, Carter makes a lot of interesting points. I also think the article which we originally based this on, which was on World Soccer Talk, wasn't it? I've been trying to bring it up. It made some interesting points in there. I thought, the fact that English sides have fallen out of the top four in the European Cup, etc. But then, they did win the Europa League very recently as well. You'd argue that that isn't a big enough measure, though. I'm not going to go for the cycles argument because I don't even think that's true. I think that last year, to some extent, was somewhat of a misnomer. I also think that, with the likes of these there's quality managers taking a lot of these teams into Europe this season, Kartik. I mean, just having Jose Mourinho back alone, it hugely strengthens English football.
Maybe not. Pellegrini.
Come on, Pellegrini as well. I mean, he took
Pellegrini. Yeah, Pellegrini has achieved a lot in Europe with minimal sides, whereas Mourinho has not. Did not win the Champions League with Real Madrid.
No, but he did with Inter.
He did with Inter
playing. And he took Chelsea very close a few times. If it wasn't for Rafa Benitez existing,
Ranieri took him close too. Ranieri took him close, and Di Matteo won it. So what's your point?
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is that it's about very slim factors which make the difference to me.
Well, but then let's also look back 2 seasons. Lawrence, you and I were sitting together in a pub in Hounslow, watching Manchester United and Manchester City, who finished 1 and 2 in the Premier League that season, 19 points clear of the third-place team. Both get eliminated at the group stage on the final day of group play.
That brings up a good point that I want to get to, because for much of the last decade preceding this one, we defined English primacy, or we emboldened English primacy based on the results in Champions League, getting 3 participants into the semifinals, consistently getting 4 teams into the quarterfinals. That, combined with the pure talent and the product, made it almost impossible to argue against the primacy of the English league. So, Lawrence, if we maintain those standards and we maintain the same way of evaluating the league, how can we possibly say that England is the best team in Europe right now?
Well, this is my question, isn't it? What are the actual values, and whether those values are even realistic? The reason I took that lead was because the article somewhat made that as an argument that, because Germany won the Champions League last season, they had 2 finalists in there, therefore they have better football. But they, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I wonder if
German teams have consistently done better during that period, which you talk about, where England was had the primacy of the top 4. German teams consistently did better in the Europa League or the UEFA Cup than.
I think we've established that isn't necessarily a great yardstick for a league.
Okay. Go
yeah,
on.
I think you can see Portugal's success in recent UEFA and Europa leagues. I mean, it's very much a cultural thing as to how much you want to succeed in that. So that I think that's an interesting, maybe even a debate for another time on the show. But Lawrence, I know that you don't want, you kind of want to talk about the standards themselves, and maybe that's where we should be going, because it does seem like we keep shifting the standards, and it makes it very easy to argue for almost any of Spain, Germany, and England as the top league if you're allowed to pick your own standards.
Yeah. Exactly, but I mean, this is part of the issue, isn't it? Kartik, I'd love to know what is appreciated about the German league, because actually it's not a league that I take a lot of time to watch. And I'm just interested in other things. It's nothing to do with whether I like it or not.
You've got the tactical acumen, which you see in Italy. You've got the good touches and technique, and a lot of Latin players contributing to that, like you see in Spain, and then you see the attacking onus, like you see in England. I think it's a perfect hybrid of the other 3 big leagues in Europe, quite frankly. I think that makes it a better league.
I'm fairly flawed at this point, Richard, actually. I don't see how I can actually argue that the Premier League is a better league than the German league. I still think, the duopolies within there, and the fact that a lot of their clubs have recently dropped away, either for financial reasons or because they weren't able to remain competitive, is partly an argument that they aren't quite as competitive or entertaining as the Premier League. But I also think there's hugely entertaining factors to the Premier League. I think that also the fact that the Premier League is such an open game makes it so interesting. And I wonder whether actually, we thought the Premier League was powerful a few years ago. It was far from entertaining when they were at the very top of their game in Europe. We were seeing a lot of 1-0s, etc. That was very boring. And I don't know whether
we were seeing teams not go out, and I think that's a good point, Lawrence, because we saw Liverpool, we saw Benitez versus Mourinho, the chess match, which would give us 0-0s and 1-1s. Ferguson versus Wenger, same thing, 0-0s, 1-1s. Now we're seeing 5-3, we're seeing 8-2, we're seeing 6-1 between the top teams.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, Mourinho made the point at the time. I think was it the first time that someone lost to it by a huge margin. He pretty much, that's a hockey score. I don't even. He didn't even care. Basically, he was like, it's stupid to even think about those things. I think was his basic analogy of that.
Hey, gentlemen, one thing that strikes me about this conversation is that it's hard to get away from cultural bias, hard to get away from how we look at style as an indicator of quality, and certainly England's league has a particular style, you can see a lot of anglicized qualities in there, and definitely as far as like English culture is concerned, in American culture, we have been more willing to incorporate Germanic elements into that style than we have been Hispanic elements. You look at the three leagues that we've basically been talking about here, although the conversation started with Premier League versus Bundesliga, but most people would say that Spain has a place in this discussion. A lot of players would, certainly, and Spain's quality of play is drastically different. It's intensely technical in that league. And I'm just wondering, Kartik, if we are a little bit predisposed to judging England and Germany better than Spain, or having a conversation about England and Germany, mostly because the cultures that we grew up in or the cultures we are ensconced in don't look at the Spanish style as play as being either entertaining or particularly on the same level as Germany.
Yeah, we grew up in Northern European cultures, and to the extent that you had some Southern European influence in the game of this country, at least my upbringing, it was Italian. It wasn't Spanish or Portuguese. So that's a very fair point, Richard. And maybe there's a generic bias towards those two leagues in the United States when we have the discussion. But I would argue that the German league is much more technical than the English league, which is part of the reason I'm saying it's a better league. That there's better technique, they're better technical players, better touches on the ball. And when we evaluate Spain in this discussion, Richard, I think Spain was right there with the two leagues last season. It was three top leagues in Europe. I think Spain, because there's been an exodus due to economic issues, almost entirely due to economic issues and tax issues with smaller clubs. I think that exodus of players to England and to lesser extent to Germany and France and Italy is weakened the league to where it's now clearly third. But we'll see as the season rolls on. Maybe Spain will reassert itself with a new crop of players.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's something that maybe we should talk about a couple months down the road. Go ahead, Lawrence.
Richard, it's also quite an interesting. I mean, I managed to get the article up, guys. It's a great article, great read by. I can't see his name. It's Arun, and I wish I could say his second name. I won't be rude enough. But one point he makes is the financial soundness of clubs in the Bundesliga and how that might make it a better quality league because it's almost like buying the rarest of beef. It's better quality because it's been reared in the right way. Do you know what I mean?
You know what? I obviously had a reaction to this. When we watch a game between Schalke and Bayer, they don't put the club's bank balance up on the scoreboard, and I don't care about it.
No, that's not what I'm saying, though, Richard. What I'm saying is
I know that's not what you're saying.
But he makes the point that all of these clubs are well financially, and therefore it's more of a as an exercise. It's more of an achievement.
What do I care about that? What do I care about that once the kickoff happens? I mean, I care about it to a certain extent, but once the game starts, I don't care how much a player makes or how much debt a club is in or anything like that. All I care about is the quality that's... Oh, I do.
No, I'm not saying... I'm saying the royal you, if you know what I mean. Like, obviously you don't care about that, but I'm saying there are people out there that care about that because they have to have arguments post-game with people. So, for instance, Kartik, it must have taken a slight shine off things a few years ago when you were going, we won the league, but then a United fan would be able to be like, well, you bought it.
Yeah, even though your starting 11 costs more than our starting 11.
No, I know that was a great point at the time, but
that's a point you made, Lawrence. Actually, you're the one who made that point. But you're right because it immediately within a couple of months, I'm in a pub in Orlando and I'm this longtime City supporter, and these Everton fans who used to be my natural allies come up to me and say, "You're only rooting for City because of the money." I said, "I was here a year ago when we didn't have the money." So it's almost a hindrance as a supporter. But anyway, we digress.
Yeah, but I mean that's the thing is that there is a romanticism about this Bundesliga affinity, this hipsterism that's developed around it to make it kind of the it league. And most of the arguments, and we see this all the time from David Kahn, center around things that actually don't matter once kickoff happens. They matter as it concerns getting the players on the field and sustaining the clubs. But as far as the actual quality of play that we should be judging, yes, it influences it, but it doesn't become an argument for or against the quality of play. the quality of play is what we should be talking about. Not, well, did you see what happened? It doesn't matter because these clubs are well run.
Well, and we know in David Kahn's world, you either restructure the Premier League on the 1980s football league, or you restructure it based on the Bundesliga, right? Those are its only two arguments.
Well, I mean, yeah, but I mean, again, if we know that those aren't necessarily realistic, but I guess the counter argument to that, Richard, would be, look, if that's the case, then why are we not even arguing about financial doping or these kind of things?
Because it's a totally different discussion. It's an interesting discussion. It's a relevant discussion. It's a completely different discussion. And the fact that people are trying to confound the two issues tells me that, unlike Kartik, they actually aren't spending a lot of time developing the reasons that German football is actually good. It's not German football, when we're talking about the quality of the actual games, isn't good because their bank balances are nice. It's good because the players are great. It's good because the style of play is great. It's good because the teams together are actually competitive, are actually world-class in relative to other world-class leagues. The bank balances absolutely don't matter. And I think that's what makes this conversation so complicated, is that people are always wanting to inject their other political issues onto something that could be based purely on what we see between minute 0 and minute 90 plus whatever. And Kartik, I mean, I'd like to know your feelings on that, because Lawrence did reference the injection of money that's come into your club, but like we've talked about before, at some point aren't the games just the games, and at some point aren't the Bundesliga games just, in your view, a little bit better quality?
Yeah. I'm not basing it on the finances at all. Now, granted, the financial strength of the Bundesliga versus a lot of clubs in England that have had turnover in ownership, and versus Spain, which is a basket case now, versus Italy, which went through an absolutely horrible period financially, at least at the football level, well, nationally too, but especially at the football level. Maybe that's why the Bundesliga is better now in terms of quality of play. Maybe it's the buying power of Bundesliga clubs, their ability to retain talent, etc., to invest in their academies. So it does go with why the Bundesliga, I think, is the best league on the pitch now in the world. But the reality is, once the game starts, as Richard says, I'm not looking at the bank balance of Schalke. I'm looking at their quality.
So I guess that's the point, isn't it?
Sorry, I'm not going to let another conversation of ours get derailed by this money issue. I want to take this in another direction. Lawrence, a couple of the things that we talked about in this segment kind of juxtapose entertainment versus quality. Premier League is supposed to be the entertaining. The Bundesliga is supposed to be quality. We both know both leagues are entertaining. We all know both these leagues are quality. So isn't this in a way a bit of a false dichotomy that we're trying to juxtapose these two things against each other as if they're mutually exclusive?
Well, this is exactly the point I was just about to make, Richard. I was not looking to derail the conversation. Let's put it that way.
Don't even try.
I mean, financially, these clubs are sound. But the point is, Richard, that I think you make a great point. Once they're out on the pitch, then there's other things that matter. I slightly disagree that you can isolate them in that way, but I think that you make a good point. And for that reason, I imagine that it is a bit of a ridiculous thing to say, well, who's the best league in the world? Because effectively, if you say to an Arsenal fan, oh, well, Germany have got the best league in the world, they're not going to go, oh, get me the next flight. They're not going to care, frankly, because they're not going to be competing in the finals of the Champions League, so it doesn't really affect them. But also, it doesn't make any difference to them. They still care about their club because they care about other things than the finance of those teams, or because another team won, and they don't love that team because it won. They love it more because it won, and that's exactly the point. It's not about the competition element necessarily in terms of technicality. Of course, people care about that, and they want their team to play good football. But saying that one team is better than another, or that one league is better than another, almost misses the point.
That's ever prescient, Lawrence. Took me right to where I wanted to close this segment. Kartik, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. To what extent does this discussion even matter?
It doesn't. I think it's just.
Thanks for watching.
No. I think it's just entertainment for guys like us and people on websites and talking heads. But doesn't really matter. I mean, I was in this position a couple years ago with Italy. The Italian league, the standard had slipped dramatically. It was, at that point, I think in my mind, clearly behind England, Spain, Germany, maybe even behind France. France was had a compelling product before there was an exodus of players from there. But did it really affect my interest in Serie A? No, it really didn't. And there was a period of time when Italian teams were bombing out of Europe with regularity, the way English teams are kind of now. and there would be the one Italian team that goes the distance, like Milan would, but Chelsea did a few years ago, but the rest of the teams were bombing out, and it didn't affect my interest. So, no, I think that to people who are football people, this discussion doesn't matter. It fills up a lot of ink, a lot of pages in newspapers, and a lot of airtime on shows like ours and others. But does it matter in the big picture, Richard? No, it's meaningless.
Richard, I think maybe one point that's good to make, though, is whether it matters or not is not necessarily the matter. The matter is that it gives you a good framework to begin to discuss the qualities of leagues, and we haven't necessarily gotten into that because maybe we did get derailed by certain things. But I think what we didn't appreciate in this conversation was the quality of both leagues for very different reasons, and that might be another reason why they're difficult to judge against each other, is because they are so vastly different.
Yeah, I don't know. I think Kartik did a very good job of describing the leagues at the beginning of this segment, but I completely agree with what you said about whether it matters or not is important to discuss, because often these topics end up being kind of bridges for people. They are the topics that people are very much interested in as they come up in their fandom, and as they move on to the next stages of their love of the game, the conversations become a little cliche, but they still provide a framework for the discussions that we will be having in the future on this show. And we will be coming back again next week, same time, same YouTube channel, same WorldSoccerTalk.com website, with another edition of This Week in Soccer. But for this week, for my co-hosts, Kartik Krishnaiyer and Lawrence McKenna, I'm Richard Farley, imploring you to enjoy your football.